1854, a future president of the United States moved to St. Louis and became a farmer. That president was Ulysses S. Grant. Hello, I'm Nathan Windrell, and today we will look at Whitehaven. Located on 7400 Grant Road, it is now owned and operated by the U.S. National Park Service. Whitehaven was built in 1816 and had 3 owners before it was owned by the Grants.
There was William Long, Theodore and Ann Lucas Hunt, and Frederick and Ellen Warrenshaw Dent. William Long built the original structure of the house. The second owners, Theodore and Ann Lucas Hunt, used Whitehaven as a refuge for mourning after Ann's brother was killed in a duel.
The third owners, the Dents' claim to fame, was their daughter, Julia.
Julia's father, Frederick, often referred to as Colonel Dent, even though he never held such a post, was a plantation owner and owned 34 slaves. He fancied himself to be a Southern gentleman. However, the next owners were by far the most memorable. Grant's father-in-law gave him 60 acres with which to farm and raise his family, in exchange for managing the Dents farm.
It took Grant 15 months to build a house for him and his family, and he named it Hardscrabble. Although Grant spent a long time building Hardscrabble, he and Julia only lived there for 4 months because Julia's mother died and her father, Frederick, asked them to move in with him to help him raise Julia's siblings.
It is a very common, there's elements of it that are very common in what would have been a rural area in the early 1800s. And each owner has made adjustments and changes, additions and subtractions over the years.
After William Long built the original 2-story portion in 1816, the next owners, the Hunts, added on a 2-room portion to the back of the house, facing towards the east.
The next owners, the Dents, the Grant's in-laws, added a room to the western portion of the house, which has something a little different about it than the rest of the structure.
There's a 1-story addition that was added on by Colonel Dent. That addition is actually made of a vertical log construction as opposed to the 2-story, which is a horizontal log. Think of a horizontal log like your old-fashioned Lincoln logs. The vertical log is very much of a French style. And we're not sure exactly whether Colonel Dent took an existing cabin and moved it there, or whether he hired someone to build it, and that's the style of building that they knew best.
The Dents also added on the back porch, a room in the eastern portion of the house, and walls on the first floor to separate the first floor into 2 rooms in the original portion of the house built by William Long. The Grants added a first-floor winter kitchen at the request of the house's caretakers, who did not want to have to go outside to the original winter kitchen to cook, and a mudroom, a room in which dirty boots and clothes are removed before entering the house.
The term Whitehaven actually is a term that Colonel Dent called the property, and that was because his I guess you'd call it his ancestral home, or the home that he came from in Maryland was called Whitehaven, and so the name, he brought the name with him, and so he called this property Whitehaven. But the house, as far as we can tell, was never actually painted white. The green is actually a later addition. Ulysses, when he's president, writes to his caretaker and says that he wants the house painted Paris green. Now, Paris green is a very fashionable color during that time frame. Think about your Victorian times. People absolutely adored color, and so Victorian houses are pinks and blues and purples and yellows, just very, very vibrant. And so this was actually probably a relatively tame color of house for that day, even though we think of it as a pretty eye-opening color today.
What was it painted before it was green?
Probably a tan, like a beige with a dark tan or a dark brown trim. I don't know that the house has an impact on specifically St. Louis history, except in the role that Grant had as a general and president, and then impacted this place. So during the Civil War, Missouri was a slave state, but part of the Union, and so the slaves here were still enslaved, even though the slaves in the South had been set free by the Emancipation Proclamation. And so it was Grant's use of the African American troops that really pushed the issue of these people can't be enslaved anymore. They're willing to fight for their freedom. They're willing to fight for the North. And so is it really fair to ask them to remain slaves? And so it was his use of the slaves or the African American soldiers that probably really helped cement the end to slavery here in Missouri as well. He went on to do quite a few other things as president that probably also had impacts on this area. I am constantly amazed by when you think about Grant's entire life, how much impact he had on every American during that time frame was just really incredible. Ulysses and Julia bought the property during the Civil War with the idea of retiring here after the war. As we know, at the end of Appomattox, or at the end of the war with the surrender of Lee at Appomattox, Grant is the general in charge of all the armies and this really big guy. And so he ends up staying in Washington, D.C. He and Johnson kind of have a falling out, and so when Johnson's presidency is over with, the people want Grant to be president, and so he's like, okay, so he's president, so his move back here gets delayed. After the presidency, after 2 terms of presidency, he and Julia decide to go on a world tour. Again, coming back here gets delayed again. After the tour, they settle in New York. He invests with his son and his son's business partner. Turns out his son's business partner was a crook, asked him for a loan of a lot of money. Grant didn't have that much money, but he went to his friend William Vanderbilt to borrow the money. Vanderbilt says sure, gives him the money, he gives it to his son and his son's business partner. His son's business partner leaves town with the money, and Grant is left holding a loan to William Vanderbilt. Now Vanderbilt's kind of like, I got plenty of money, it's no big deal. But Grant's a very honorable person, and he's not going to let that just slide. And so he basically turns over the deed to this property here and others to William Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt really has no interest in this property. He owns it for a couple of years, and then turns it over to a man by the name of Luther Kahn. Ironically, Luther Kahn was a Confederate officer. Kahn thought it was kind of cool, though, because of the way the war ended. Kahn didn't have a lot of hard feelings to Grant, and so he was kind of like, this is a cool place. This deserves to be saved, and he didn't mind people coming and visiting and seeing the house where Ulysses S. Grant lived. The property goes through a couple more hands, ends up with a family by the name of Winslick. The Winslicks owned this place for 3 generations, and they also knew it was Ulysses S. Grant's, and they took really good care of it. They went ahead and made changes, just like you would make changes to your house, but they recorded what changes they had made, and so when the last of the Winslicks decided they really couldn't keep up the house and they were wanting to move, none of the kids wanted it. They thought they would just go ahead and sell it. They didn't really want to sell it to a developer, but they, were didn't have a lot of choice. A group of local residents said, "Wait, no, we need to save this place. This is a really important place." And so a group called Save Grant's Whitehaven was formed. They raised money, they raised awareness, they got legislation processed through Congress to designate this area a National Historic Site. Essentially, it was their work that eventually made it go into the National Park Service.